Late in 1943, the war in the Pacific reached a brutal stage. The United States Navy pushed across the vast ocean, taking island after island from the Japanese. Each step forward brought them closer to the Japanese homeland. In these waters, carrier groups and fleets faced waves of Japanese aircraft determined to stop them. Japanese pilots had grown skilled at attacking American ships. Dive bombers screamed down from the clouds. Torpedo planes skimmed the surface, racing toward destroyers and carriers. When enough aircraft attacked at once, even the best anti-aircraft fire could not stop them. Explosions tore through American decks, and ships burned. By mid-1944, Japanese commanders knew their best chance to halt the Americans was to strike with overwhelming air power. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, they sent hundreds of aircraft to break through the U.S. defensive line. The plan followed old patterns that had worked earlier in the war. Massed formations diving at the fleet, forcing American gunners to guess where to fire. Japanese pilots believed that if they flew low and fast or high and steep, they could reach the carriers and cripple them before the invasion of the Marianas. But this time, something strange happened. The formations never reached their targets. Instead, as they approached within miles of the U.S. fleet, they began to vanish from the sky. Japanese pilots were shocked as planes beside them exploded in midair, far away from the ships. The sudden destruction created panic over the radios. Squadron leaders called for regrouping, but confusion spread as more aircraft erupted into fireballs without warning. By the end of the day, hundreds of Japanese planes were gone. American losses were small. Sailors later described the scene as a shooting gallery. It became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Unseen by the Japanese, the Americans had introduced a new weapon to their anti-aircraft guns. It was called the proximity fuse. Unlike older shells that relied on timers or direct hits, this fuse contained a small electronic device. Inside was a tiny radio transmitter. When the shell came close to a solid target like an airplane, the signal bounced back and the shell exploded. This meant gunners no longer had to guess the exact moment to fire. A near miss now counted as a kill. Before the proximity fuse, anti-aircraft fire depended on mathematics and luck. Gunners estimated speed, altitude, and distance. Even skilled crews could place dozens of shells in the air and hit nothing. Japanese pilots often flew through heavy flak, weaving and rolling, confident that most shells would burst too early or too late. The proximity fuse changed all of that overnight. Every round became deadly, filling the sky with invisible danger. The device itself was a closely guarded secret. Scientists in the United States and Britain worked in deep secrecy to design it. The parts had to be small enough to fit into a shell but strong enough to survive being fired at high speed. Once perfected, the Navy began equipping warships with the new shells. Crews were ordered to recover any that failed to detonate so the enemy would not discover how they worked. For months, very few outside of the highest command even knew such technology existed. When the Japanese launched large-scale attacks, like those at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, they unknowingly flew into a new kind of defense. American cruisers and destroyers created layers of anti-aircraft fire. With the proximity fuse, these layers became almost impenetrable. Japanese formations were shredded long before they could dive on their targets. During the Okinawa campaign in April 1945, the Japanese turned to kamikaze tactics. These were suicide attacks meant to crash directly into American ships. In the past, such desperate attacks might have caused heavy damage. At Okinawa, the proximity fuse again proved decisive. Many kamikaze planes never came close. American sailors reported seeing attackers burst into flames hundreds of yards away, destroyed by shells that detonated near their wings and fuselages. Even when small groups slipped through, the overall effect was to reduce the scale of damage and save countless ships from destruction. Japanese pilots who survived these missions spoke later of their shock and fear. They described the sky as a wall of fire. Some believed the Americans had invented an invisible net or a new type of radar weapon. They could not understand why so many planes were lost so quickly. Morale began to collapse. Training new pilots already took too long, and now they were being wiped out in staggering numbers before learning combat skills. Squadrons that once returned with at least half their force now came back empty or with only a few survivors. On American ships, the mood shifted as well. In earlier battles, crews had watched helplessly as friends died in sudden explosions caused by enemy bombs and torpedoes. Now they saw their guns cutting down attackers at a distance. Confidence rose. Sailors spoke in hushed tones about the mysterious shells but were warned never to reveal details. Letters home were censored, and even off-duty conversations were monitored to prevent leaks. The secrecy was so strict that some sailors who served with the weapon never learned how it truly worked until years after the war. The effect on naval tactics was immediate. With fewer ships lost, the U.S. Navy could maintain its forward momentum across the Pacific. Amphibious landings faced less risk because the fleet could defend itself more effectively. Japanese strategy, which relied on large waves of aircraft to overwhelm defenses, became obsolete almost overnight. Their remaining carriers were rendered useless, as they no longer had the trained pilots or the ability to penetrate the new American defenses. In battle after battle, from the Marianas to Iwo Jima, the same pattern repeated. Japanese commanders ordered massive airstrikes. The Americans held their positions. As the attacking planes drew near, proximity-fused shells filled the sky. The results were the same each time. Destroyed squadrons, few hits on U.S. ships, and a growing sense of despair among the Japanese forces. This shift marked a turning point in the war at sea, driven by a small but revolutionary device hidden inside each shell. The proximity fuse began as a simple idea with enormous potential. If a shell could explode when it came close to an enemy aircraft instead of only when it hit or when a timer went off, the chances of destroying that target would rise sharply. In the early years of the war, anti-aircraft gunners faced a grim task. They calculated range and speed with stopwatches and slide rules, firing round after round into the sky with no certainty of a hit. Even a perfect aim often failed. A shell might pass within feet of a plane and still do nothing. This was a deadly problem in the Pacific, where Japanese pilots used fast dive bombers and torpedo planes that could dodge and weave around predictable bursts of fire. American fleets needed something new. Scientists in the United States and Britain began working on a solution in the early 1940s. The project was so secret that only a small circle of military leaders and researchers knew of its existence. The idea was bold. Each shell would carry its own tiny radar. When the shell flew close to an aircraft, the radar signal would bounce back. The returning signal would trigger the detonator, setting off the explosive charge at exactly the right moment. This meant the shell no longer needed a direct hit. A burst near the plane's wing or fuselage could still tear it apart. The design faced major challenges. The electronics had to be incredibly small to fit inside the narrow body of a shell. They also had to be strong enough to survive the violent acceleration of being fired from a naval gun. Early prototypes broke apart from the force of launch. Engineers redesigned the components again and again, solving one problem at a time. The final product was rugged, reliable, and precise. To protect the technology, production was carried out in guarded factories under constant watch. Workers were told almost nothing about what they were building. They were given instructions on how to assemble parts but not why they were important. By late 1942, the first working models were ready for testing. Navy gunners fired shells fitted with the new fuse at remote-controlled drones. The results stunned everyone present. Where once a single drone might take dozens of shells to hit, now only a few shots were needed. The kill rate increased 5 to 10 times over conventional timed fuses. For commanders planning future battles, this was a breakthrough. A small fleet could now defend itself against much larger waves of enemy aircraft. Deployment began quietly in 1943. The first ships to receive the proximity fuse were in the Pacific, where Japanese air power remained a serious threat. Crews were briefed under strict secrecy rules. If a shell failed to explode, sailors were ordered to risk their lives to retrieve it before it sank. They could not allow even a single dud to fall into enemy hands. Any hint of how the fuse worked might allow Japanese scientists to copy or counter it. Even letters home were censored to remove any mention of unusual ammunition or strange results in battle. The fuse itself was a small marvel of wartime engineering. Inside its metal casing sat a miniature vacuum tube, a power source, and a tiny radio transmitter. When the shell was fired, the transmitter began to send out a steady signal. As the shell traveled through the air, if it came near a solid object like the metal skin of an aircraft, the signal bounced back to a receiver within the fuse. The circuit sensed this change and triggered the detonator instantly. The entire process happened in a fraction of a second, far too fast for human reaction. This automatic detonation allowed each shell to function as its own hunter, seeking out targets without additional guidance. When the first combat tests began, Japanese pilots had no idea what they were facing. They continued to use tactics that had worked in earlier battles: fast dives, tight formations, and sudden altitude changes to confuse gunners. None of these tricks worked against the proximity fuse. Even if a pilot swerved at the last moment, a near miss would still destroy his plane. In past engagements, attackers often flew through flak bursts with minimal losses, reaching the ships to drop bombs or launch torpedoes. Now, whole formations disappeared miles from their targets. The effect on battle tactics was immediate. American cruisers and destroyers could form defensive rings around carriers, creating overlapping zones of fire. Each ship contributed to a wall of shells that detonated automatically as enemy aircraft approached. This shield reduced the danger to carriers, which were the most valuable ships in the fleet. It also freed fighter squadrons to focus on offensive roles instead of purely defensive patrols. Japanese commanders, unaware of the new technology, assumed the Americans had somehow doubled or tripled their firepower overnight. Sailors who manned the guns quickly noticed the difference. Before, they had fired hundreds of rounds during an attack with little visible effect. Now they saw attackers burst apart in midair. Some described it as if the sky itself had turned hostile. These men still faced danger, but for the first time, they felt they could protect their ships and each other. They took pride in the results but remained silent about how it was achieved. Orders forbade them to discuss the fuse outside of briefings or reports. The proximity fuse did not only improve the defense of single ships. It changed how entire fleets moved and fought. Task forces could advance deeper into enemy waters with confidence. When island invasions took place, transports and landing craft were safer under the umbrella of automatically detonating fire. In a war where one lucky bomb could sink a carrier or a troopship, this was a decisive advantage. Japanese planners had no answer. They continued to launch mass attacks, unaware that a hidden device inside each shell was quietly rewriting the rules of aerial warfare. By the time they realized something had changed, it was too late. The proximity fuse had spread across the U.S. Navy, becoming a silent partner in every major battle of the Pacific. Its presence was never announced, its workings never revealed to the enemy, but its effect was plain to anyone who looked at the sky and saw Japanese planes falling in flames long before they reached their targets. Before the arrival of the proximity fuse, battles at sea followed a grim and familiar pattern. When enemy aircraft approached, American gunners opened fire long before the planes were in range. Black bursts of flak filled the sky, creating walls of smoke and shrapnel. This was called curtain fire. It was meant to scare pilots and disrupt their aim, but it rarely destroyed many planes. Japanese aviators understood the danger, but they also knew their odds. If they stayed low, flew fast, and changed direction at the right moment, they could usually break through. Many survived the run to release their bombs or torpedoes, even if half their squadron fell along the way. It was a brutal calculation, but it worked often enough to keep American sailors fearful. A few hits on a carrier or battleship could shift the balance of an entire campaign. These battles were decided by nerve and timing. Japanese pilots relied on speed, precision, and aggression. Their formations were tight and disciplined. When they dove, they committed fully even when it meant near certain death. American gunners knew this and fired relentlessly, but without the right tools, they were often just filling the air with explosions that looked threatening but did little real harm. Ships took hits, decks burned, and lives were lost. That was the accepted reality of naval warfare in the Pacific. Everything changed in June of 1944. The U.S. fleet gathered near the Marianas to support a massive invasion. The Japanese command prepared to defend those islands at any cost. They launched their remaining carrier air power in a decisive strike. Hundreds of fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes lifted off in coordinated waves. Their goal was to smash through the American screen, sink the carriers, and stop the invasion before it reached the beaches. As the Japanese approached, they expected the same kind of battle they had fought since Pearl Harbor. They knew there would be flak, and they knew many would not return. But they also believed that some would get through. Their radios carried calm, steady voices, each pilot confident in his training and experience. Then, as the first wave came within range, the unexpected happened. Planes began to disappear in midair, far from the fleet. From a distance, it looked like invisible hands were swatting them from the sky. A dive bomber banked left to line up for an attack and erupted into a fireball before it even began its dive. A torpedo plane flying low across the waves simply broke apart, wings shearing off as it exploded above the water. No one on the Japanese side understood why. The anti-aircraft fire looked the same as before, the same black puffs against the clouds. But now, those bursts were suddenly lethal. Confusion spread quickly over the radios. Pilots called out targets, then screamed warnings as the formations thinned at an impossible rate. Squadron leaders ordered evasive maneuvers, shouting for their men to break formation and scatter. It made no difference. The shells detonated automatically, close enough to tear apart planes even when the pilots dodged. In previous battles, gunners had to guess where a plane would be several seconds ahead and set their fuses carefully. A small error meant the shell would burst harmlessly in empty sky. Now the shells did the work themselves. They found their mark the moment they came near a target. On American ships, gunners saw the results and were stunned. What had once been frantic, desperate firing became controlled and efficient. Crews loaded and fired, watched enemy planes vanish, then shifted calmly to the next threat. A sailor on a cruiser described it later as if the guns had suddenly learned how to aim on their own. The fleet moved forward with confidence. Where before they had expected to take damage, now entire waves of attackers were erased miles from the ships. The Japanese called the battle the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot after it ended, though the name came from American pilots who swept up the survivors. Out of hundreds of planes launched, only a handful made it through. Many never even saw the ships they were sent to destroy. For the Japanese command, it was a shock they could not explain. Reports from returning pilots were confused and grim. Some swore they had been hit by invisible weapons. Others thought the Americans had doubled the number of guns on each ship overnight. None guessed the truth. A small device hidden inside each shell had rewritten the rules of defense. The impact was even more dramatic during the Okinawa campaign the following year. By then, Japanese tactics had shifted to kamikaze attacks. Pilots took off knowing they would not return. Their mission was to crash directly into a target and destroy it through sheer impact. Against older defenses, this tactic was terrifying. Even a few successful strikes could sink a destroyer or cripple a carrier. At Okinawa, the proximity fuse faced its hardest test. The results were devastating for the attackers. Kamikaze planes never reached their targets in many cases. As they descended toward the fleet, they flew into an unseen barrier of explosive shells. Ships coordinated their fire to cover every approach. Planes were torn apart long before they could crash into the decks. Sailors watched the burning wreckage fall into the sea, often before a single American ship was touched. Some attackers did break through, causing tragic losses, but the overall effect was clear. The new defenses had turned even suicide missions into failures. Japanese pilots who survived spoke later of the terror they felt. The sky itself seemed alive, ready to destroy them no matter what they did. In earlier battles, a skilled pilot could rely on his instincts and reflexes to survive. Now nothing seemed to matter. They could not see the mechanism that killed them, only the sudden destruction of their comrades. Radio chatter during these attacks often descended into chaos. Pilots shouted warnings, cried out for help, or fell silent mid-sentence as their planes disintegrated. For the Americans, the battles were still deadly and exhausting, but they no longer felt helpless. Their ships moved with purpose, protected by technology the enemy could not match. Gunners no longer fired blindly. They worked with a sense of control, each round fired with the knowledge that it could truly make a difference. From the decks of the fleet to the cockpits of the Japanese planes, the balance of power had shifted. The war at sea would never be the same. Japanese pilots went into battle with the same confidence they had carried since the early days of the war. Many were veterans of earlier campaigns. They had faced heavy anti-aircraft fire before and learned how to fly through it. They knew some of them would be shot down, but they trusted their skill and tactics. When they formed up in tight squadrons and roared toward the American fleet, they expected to see black clouds of flak burst ahead of them. They expected confusion and danger, but also a chance to break through and strike. That had always been the rhythm of battle in the Pacific. Then, suddenly, everything changed. As they approached their targets, planes began exploding before they reached diving range. At first, the pilots thought it was bad luck, a few well-placed shots. But as more planes fell, disbelief spread. Entire formations disappeared in seconds. Pilots shouted into their radios, trying to understand what was happening. There were no clear patterns, no safe altitude, no reliable maneuver that could save them. Even experienced aces were destroyed mid-dive without warning. Survivors described it later as flying into a trap they could not see. Some pilots began to believe the Americans had created a new kind of weapon, something invisible and unstoppable. Rumors spread quickly through the air groups. One story claimed the Americans had built a massive radar system that could burn planes from the sky. Another said there were hidden energy weapons aboard the carriers. No one had proof and no one had answers. They only knew that once their squadrons entered the outer edge of the American defensive screen, destruction came without reason. Morale began to sink. The Japanese Navy already struggled to train new pilots. By 1944, many replacements were young men with only a few hours of flight time. The veterans who might have taught them were dying faster than they could be replaced. Each failed mission left fewer survivors to guide the next attack. In ready rooms and briefing halls, silence replaced the usual chatter. Pilots studied maps and targets, but they no longer believed in their odds of success. Some spoke openly of hopelessness. Others kept their fears inside, knowing they would soon take off on one-way flights they could not avoid. One pilot who lived through the Battle of the Philippine Sea described the experience years later. He remembered seeing planes ahead of him vanish in sudden bursts of fire, the wreckage spinning past his cockpit. He never saw the shells that killed them. There was only a wall of explosions between him and the enemy fleet. He turned back before reaching his target, his radio filled with screams and static. The next day, he learned that only a handful of his comrades had returned. He never flew again. Among the men who continued to fight, this sense of mystery and dread grew stronger with each mission. The sky itself seemed to have turned against them. On the American side, the reaction was entirely different. Sailors who had once braced for disaster now saw their defenses working in ways they had never imagined. In earlier battles, they had watched helplessly as bombs fell and torpedoes struck home. Even when they fired thousands of rounds, they often saw enemy planes push through and hit their ships. With the new fuses, the results were immediate and visible. They watched attackers burst apart far from the fleet. Ships that once expected heavy damage survived unscathed. The relief was powerful. Crews felt that they finally had a fighting chance. Instead of simply enduring wave after wave of attacks, they could strike back effectively. The sight of incoming aircraft no longer carried the same level of dread. Sailors still feared battle, but now they trusted their guns. Each engagement reinforced their confidence. Morale across the fleet rose as losses decreased. Commanders noticed the change. Reports from ship captains spoke of crews working with greater focus and discipline. Gunners fired with precision, knowing their efforts mattered. Despite this growing confidence, secrecy remained absolute. Only a small number of officers knew how the new shells worked. Sailors were ordered never to speak of them outside their duties. Even in letters home, they were forbidden to mention the strange results they witnessed. Censors reviewed every piece of mail leaving the fleet. Anyone caught breaking the rules faced punishment. Crews understood why. If the Japanese discovered the secret, they might find a way to counter it. Silence was another weapon as vital as the guns themselves. On deck, sailors talked in guarded tones. They used vague language when discussing their victories. Some called the shells specials or the new ones, never saying more. Many did not fully understand what gave them their edge, and they did not need to. It was enough to know that when they fired, enemy planes fell. Even among friends, they avoided speculation. The weight of secrecy was heavy, but they accepted it as part of their duty. As the war continued, the contrast between the two sides grew stark. Japanese pilots went into battle uncertain and afraid, carrying questions that had no answers. Each mission felt more like a sacrifice than a fight. American sailors faced the same battles with a growing sense of control. They still lost ships and comrades, but they believed their fleet was protected by something reliable and unseen. The difference showed in every clash. One side flew into the unknown, haunted by mystery and fear. The other stood firm, their confidence hidden behind silence and smoke. The psychological effect was as important as the physical results. The Japanese could see their strength slipping away with every failed attack. They no longer believed victory was possible. The Americans, by contrast, saw their survival as proof that they could press forward. In war, weapons are not only tools of destruction. They also shape belief. The proximity fuse did both at once, crushing enemy formations while lifting the spirits of those it protected. It remained a silent presence, invisible to those who faced it and secret even to many who used it, yet it shaped the thoughts and actions of everyone caught beneath its reach. The destruction at the Battle of the Philippine Sea was more than a single defeat for Japan. It marked the end of their ability to fight a modern naval air war. Before the battle, Japan still had several carriers and a corps of experienced pilots. They believed a decisive strike could stall the American advance. The battle proved them wrong. Over the course of 2 days in June 1944, wave after wave of Japanese planes lifted off and never came back. American fighters cut through the first groups, while ships below fired nonstop into the sky. Those who escaped the fighters were met by an unbroken wall of flak. The proximity fuse made this barrier lethal. By the end of the battle, the Japanese Navy had lost hundreds of aircraft and most of their remaining veteran pilots. Some carriers returned to port almost empty. Others had flight decks filled with fuel fires and shattered planes. This loss could not be repaired. Training new pilots took time Japan no longer had. Resources were dwindling, and factories could not replace the planes as quickly as they were destroyed. The defeat earned the nickname the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot among American pilots because so many Japanese planes were shot down with so few losses in return. The battle also crippled Japan's overall naval strategy. Carriers were meant to project power across the ocean. Without skilled aviators to launch from them, the ships became little more than floating targets. Japan tried to hide this weakness by continuing to move their carriers as if they were still a threat. At Leyte Gulf later that year, Japanese carriers were sent out as decoys to lure the American fleet away from their invasion forces. This plan showed how far their power had fallen. Instead of leading attacks, carriers were sacrificed to buy time. With the skies cleared, the U.S. Navy gained freedom of movement across the Central Pacific. Amphibious landings on islands like Saipan, Tinian, and Guam took place under a level of protection not seen before. The fleet could bring in troopships and supplies without the constant fear of massive airstrikes. This protection extended beyond the immediate battle zones. Supply lines from Hawaii and the West Coast became safer, allowing reinforcements and equipment to flow steadily forward. For the first time, the U.S. could conduct sustained offensive operations deep in enemy territory. The effects of this shift were seen in the battles that followed. When the U.S. invaded Iwo Jima and later Okinawa, they faced fierce ground resistance, but their fleets remained largely intact. Japanese aircraft still attacked, but they no longer did so in organized strength. Instead of coordinated raids, the Americans faced scattered groups of planes, often flown by poorly trained pilots. Even these were cut down before reaching the fleet. The proximity fuse played a direct role here. It turned defensive fire into a nearly impenetrable shield. Japan's leaders saw the problem but had no solution. They could not produce enough skilled pilots or aircraft to rebuild their lost air power. Out of desperation, they turned to a new tactic: the kamikaze. These suicide missions were meant to replace precision attacks with sheer impact. A single plane, packed with explosives, could crash into a ship and sink it even if it was shot up along the way. In theory, this tactic bypassed the need for survival or return. At first, kamikaze strikes shocked the Americans. The sight of a plane deliberately diving into a ship was terrifying. Early attacks inflicted heavy damage on destroyers and transports. But the effectiveness of these missions faded quickly. The proximity fuse again made a difference. As suicide planes approached, defensive guns detonated shells near them automatically. Many kamikaze aircraft exploded before they ever reached their targets. Those that did get through faced multiple layers of defense and coordinated fire from entire task groups. The Japanese adapted by sending larger waves of suicide planes, hoping that some would break through by sheer numbers. These attacks inflicted losses, especially at Okinawa, but the cost to Japan was catastrophic. They were burning through their remaining planes and pilots with almost no strategic return. The U.S. fleet stayed in position, its carriers launching constant strikes against Japanese ground forces and infrastructure. Each failed kamikaze wave further drained Japan's strength and morale. On the American side, the reduced threat from enemy air power allowed planners to focus on the next stages of the campaign. The Navy no longer had to devote as many resources to defending its carriers. This freed up fighters to conduct offensive sweeps against Japanese bases. It also allowed bombardments and landings to proceed under steady cover. The rhythm of the war shifted. Instead of halting after each island battle to repair losses, the U.S. could move directly from one objective to the next. Japanese ground forces began to feel the consequences of this shift. At Iwo Jima, they fought with courage and tenacity, but they received almost no support from the air. At Okinawa, their remaining aircraft were committed to kamikaze attacks rather than defending troops on the island. Without air cover, Japanese positions were pounded day and night by carrier-based aircraft and naval guns. The defenders were left isolated and doomed. The imbalance grew so extreme that by late 1945, Japan had almost no functional naval air units left. A few aircraft remained in reserve on the home islands, but fuel shortages and lack of trained pilots rendered them ineffective. The once mighty carrier force that had struck Pearl Harbor was gone. Even when Japan launched suicide attacks in the final months, they did so knowing they could not change the outcome. The proximity fuse had helped create this reality by making it nearly impossible for their planes to reach their targets. American sailors understood the advantage they held, though they rarely spoke of the secret behind it. Reports of their victories reached Washington and were studied by planners shaping the endgame of the war. The shift in naval balance gave U.S. leaders the confidence to push forward without pause. It also gave them leverage in strategic discussions about how to end the conflict. In a matter of months, the Pacific War had transformed from a dangerous contest to a steady advance toward Japan itself. The destruction of Japanese naval aviation opened the path for the final stages of the campaign. When the war ended, the true nature of the proximity fuse finally became known. For years, it had remained one of the most closely guarded secrets of the Allied effort. Sailors who had served with it learned for the first time exactly how the strange, powerful shells worked. Scientists and engineers who had labored in secret factories could finally speak openly about what they had created. The device that had been hidden inside the nose of each anti-aircraft shell was now revealed as a landmark in military technology. It was small, compact, and simple in appearance, but its effect on the war had been immense. The proximity fuse represented a leap forward in how weapons were designed and used. Before its introduction, anti-aircraft fire depended entirely on human judgment. Gunners estimated where a fast-moving plane would be by the time the shell reached it, then set a timed fuse in the hope of an explosion at just the right moment. Even the most skilled crews often failed to bring down more than a few attackers. The proximity fuse changed this balance. It gave each shell the ability to act on its own, using a built-in sensor to detect when a target was close. This was a new concept, a weapon that could respond automatically without a human triggering the final step. That idea would shape the future of warfare. After the war, the technology behind the fuse became the basis for many new systems. The same principle of automatic detection and detonation was applied to missiles and guided projectiles. Modern air defense weapons trace their roots back to those first wartime fuses. What began as a small radio signal bouncing off an airplane evolved into radar-guided missiles and precision-guided munitions. Engineers who had worked on the original fuse went on to design new generations of weapons that extended the concept far beyond its original form. Today, nearly every advanced defense system owes something to the innovations made during that period. During the war, the proximity fuse had been kept secret to prevent the enemy from developing countermeasures. After the conflict ended, that secrecy gave way to study and analysis. Military historians placed it alongside radar and the atomic bomb as one of the three most important technological breakthroughs of the conflict. Each of these inventions changed the way battles were fought. Radar extended vision across great distances, the atomic bomb introduced a new level of destructive power, and the proximity fuse turned ordinary guns into precision tools. General Dwight D. Eisenhower later said that the fuse had been one of the most important new developments in the war, a statement that reflected its enormous impact on the outcome of many battles. The legacy of the proximity fuse was not only technical but also strategic. Its success demonstrated how a single innovation could reshape entire campaigns. Before the fuse, Japanese tactics relied on overwhelming numbers. Large groups of planes would attack at once, counting on at least some of them to break through. The introduction of the fuse rendered this approach obsolete almost overnight. Formations that once posed a deadly threat were destroyed far from their targets. This forced Japan to adopt kamikaze tactics in desperation, a sign of how completely the old methods had failed. The lesson was clear. When technology shifts, strategies must change with it or face disaster. The Allies also learned about the value of secrecy and careful deployment. During the war, commanders took extraordinary measures to keep the proximity fuse hidden. Crews were ordered to retrieve unexploded shells, even at great risk, to prevent the enemy from examining them. Soldiers and sailors were forbidden to discuss the weapon, even in personal letters. This strict control preserved the element of surprise. It showed that a breakthrough was most effective when introduced at the right moment and in the right place. Once the enemy knew about it, its power could diminish as countermeasures were developed. The proximity fuse also revealed how closely science and warfare had become linked. The device was not invented by soldiers in the field but by scientists working in laboratories and workshops far from the front lines. Their understanding of electronics and radio waves made the fuse possible. This cooperation between research and combat operations set a pattern for the future. In later conflicts, governments would turn to scientists and engineers as key players in planning and strategy. The war had proven that technical knowledge could be as decisive as troop numbers or firepower. For those who fought in the Pacific, the fuse left lasting memories. American sailors remembered the change it brought to their daily battles. They went from watching helplessly as enemy planes struck their ships to seeing those same attackers destroyed before they came close. The sense of relief was profound. Survivors spoke of how the weapon gave them confidence to press forward into enemy waters. Many did not fully understand the science behind it, but they knew it had saved lives. Japanese pilots who survived encounters with the fuse carried different memories. They described the sky as if it had turned against them. One man said it felt like flying into a wall of invisible fire. Others recalled the confusion of missions where their comrades vanished without warning. These accounts were studied by historians after the war, providing a human view of how the weapon had changed the psychological landscape of battle. In the decades that followed, museums and archives displayed examples of the original fuses. Visitors could see the small, unassuming devices that had once been guarded more closely than gold. Military academies taught the story of their development as a case study in innovation. The lessons went beyond the technical details. They showed how leadership, secrecy, and timing could turn a simple idea into a decisive advantage. The influence of the proximity fuse can still be felt today. Whenever a modern missile locks onto its target or a defensive system automatically engages an incoming threat, it echoes the principles first tested in those wartime shells. What began as a secret project on the workbenches of wartime scientists became a foundation for the complex defense networks of the modern world. It reminded future generations that even small changes in technology could alter the course of history.